Vladimir Putin says the war in Ukraine may be nearing its end, and then he makes a suggestion. Europe should send a negotiator. His preferred choice, former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder.
Personally, I prefer the former Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Mr. Schröder. Otherwise, let the Europeans choose a leader they trust and who hasn't said unpleasant things about us. Please, we have never been closed to negotiations. Never.
The suggestion came at a press conference in Moscow on May the 9th, Victory Day. It is a striking proposal. Schröder is a man with long-standing ties to the Kremlin. In Germany, he's deeply controversial. And in Ukraine, many see him as compromised. So what exactly is Putin doing here? Is that a diplomatic opening or something more strategic? These are just some of the questions that I'd like to dig into with my guests today on Berlin Briefing. Judy Dempsey, a scholar from Carnegie Europe. Hello, very good to have you here.
Thank you very much, Nina. Thank you.
So you've written a book about Angela Merkel and you've basically followed consecutive German government's policy when it comes to Russia. And this is something where I'm really interested to hear your insights. You know, how does that create a division potentially in Germany, this proposal by Vladimir Putin? But we're also joined by Roman Goncharenko, my colleague from our Ukrainian service. So, Roman, let's just get started. When you first heard Vladimir Putin mention this proposal that Gerhard Schröder could come into the game, what were your first thoughts?
Well, I was not very much surprised. I think Vladimir Putin has several goals here. First, of course, it's a provocation, and he's trying to undermine European unity between Europe and the United States in negotiations to end the Russian war against Ukraine, unity between Europe and Ukraine. But I think there is more to it. I think his strategic perspective or his wish is to have a leverage in future talks about Ukraine's membership in the European Union. So Russia would like to have a word in how fast Ukraine could join the European Union and on what terms. And this is only the beginning.
Okay, that's already a lot to unpack. And Judy, I just want to hear your first thoughts before we get into the discussion.
My first thoughts were partly one of surprise. I mean, Schröder's been out of the picture for such a long time. He doesn't speak publicly about Russia. He doesn't speak publicly about the war. He doesn't speak publicly about Ukraine. Actually, he doesn't speak publicly about many things at all at the moment. But I think Vladimir Putin's sort of suggestion, for want of a better term, is to take the Europeans off guard, to divide the Europeans, and to sort of put in the language, well, maybe it is time to mediate. But what does mediation mean when it doesn't mention Ukraine?
And divide he did. The reactions from European officials were swift. So maybe we can just get essentially the foreign policy spokesperson of the European institutions, Kaja Kallas. Let's just listen to her.
First, if we give the right to Russia to appoint a negotiator on our behalf, that would not be very wise. And second, I think Gerhard Schröder has been the high-level lobbyist for Russian state-owned companies. So it's clear why Putin wants him to be the person, so that actually, he would be sitting on both sides of the table.
Okay, so the European Union itself, the spokesperson, can you just give us some background on her, Judy? Why did she react like this?
She's taken, first of all, she's from Estonia, which is very important.
Which is a small Baltic country.
A very small Baltic country. It has the memory of occupation, long occupied until 1991 by then the former Soviet Union. And they are acutely aware of the need to defend themselves. They are acutely aware of the Europeans to stick together vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin and Russia. And she's acutely aware that the Europeans must be steadfast when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And to a point that, saying that Russia could appoint a mediator, well, I don't think it's up to Russia, actually. But if you take Putin at his word, and he says, well, maybe if it's not Schröder, could be a European spokesperson or a mediator. Well, let's see if the Europeans would respond in some way. But saying no without coming up with a sort of coherent answer, it's not the wisest position, actually.
Here in Berlin, the tone was cautious and sceptical. Just to get the full picture, we're also going to listen to the government spokesperson.
I would advise setting aside German sensitivities for the moment and perhaps also recognising the attempt to sow division that lies behind these proposals. And that is why we're going to get back to a serious footing. Seriousness requires that we continue to work through the established channels of communication, that Russia drops its conditions for such talks, and that it also recognises the hopelessness of the war situation. And if it genuinely wishes to bring this war to a swift end, it should also enter into serious talks on the matter.
Okay, so we've got essentially the various reactions. To understand why this matters, and I'll get back to Roman in a second, but first, Judy, we need to give an international audience some context here. Who is Gerhard Schröder? Why is he so controversial here in Germany? Outside of Germany, he's known as one of the country's former chancellors.
Gerhard Schröder is a very complex person. Politically, domestically, he's probably the only chancellor from the late 1990s up to the present who actually introduced radical economic reforms for the German economy. In fact, he kick-started the German economy, which was in a very bad situation. And when he became chancellor, he introduced these huge labour reforms, and as a result, he lost the election. He was kicked out and replaced by Angela Merkel. Now, that was the domestic side.
But he did restart the economy.
He really did.
Angela Merkel really did benefit
It really
from that.
did. And since then, Angela Merkel didn't do anything with reforms, neither did Olaf Scholz. And now we have the current chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who is stuck in terms of trying to push through any kind of reform agenda. Now, that's the domestic context. The international context plus the foreign policy context is Gerhard Schröder's extraordinarily close ties to Vladimir Putin and also to Gazprom, the big state gas monopoly. And indeed, under his watch, Germany became even more dependent on buying and importing Russian gas. And it became a very special German-Russian economic relationship with Schröder at the top and Vladimir Putin at the top. And this actual energy dependence prevented Germany from diversifying, and it created an awful lot of bad feeling between Germany and its Polish neighbour, and indeed the Baltic countries, because they felt that both Vladimir Putin and Gerhard Schröder were doing deals behind their back and at the expense of these countries. So all these things are
Sorry,
there.
but when you say close ties with Russian energy companies, this is literally close ties, right? If you could just elaborate.
There were more than close ties. When Schröder was elected Chancellor, the first thing he did was hold a press conference. If my memory serves me, it was in the Adlon Hotel. And there he announced he was going to be on one of the big members of Gazprom, this huge state monopoly run essentially by Putin and his colleagues, supporters or whatever. And he forged an incredible close economic relationship, political relationship and a personal relationship. Actually, because of Putin, Gerhard Schröder could adopt one or two children. And this is quite interesting that not only did he adopt these two children with the help of Vladimir Putin, because there was very strict adoption laws introduced by Putin over the years in Russia, but have you heard Gerhard Schröder speak at all about the kidnapping of thousands of Ukrainian children by the Russians? I mean, if children are so important, and indeed Putin did help Schröder, it'd be very interesting to hear Gerhard Schröder actually speak out on this. But The element of Schröder is his controversial aspects, and there's some in Eastern Germany who are still pro-Russian, still pro-Schröder, and say, oh, give him a chance, let's end this war, and indeed some in East Germany are against Ukraine. So Schröder fits into this element, oh, well, let's give this a chance now.
So, you know, there are economic ties, political ties, and personal ties through the children. It's just really important to know this context about Gerhard Schröder. And actually, we found a clip from December 2017. So remember, this is something which Gerhard Schröder told my colleague Christian Tripper in an interview about his advice to the future German government when it comes to Russia policy. This is in December 2017, after Russia invaded Crimea. Let's just listen to that bit.
What policies should the new German government pursue with regard to Russia? What is your advice?
Cooperation rather than confrontation. I think that makes sense. We need something like a revival of the policy of détente. It's about time, high time in fact. In light of what is happening in the Donbass, I'm in favour of lifting sanctions step by step rather than constantly thinking only about extending or tightening them. If there is a prisoner exchange, if there is a withdrawal of heavy weapons, verified in a transparent manner by the relevant people, then we should also go ahead and say, OK, we see goodwill. And we want to reward that by lifting sanctions step by step. As for the sanctions, incidentally, it is now very obvious. As the economic institutes have established, they are, as we know, primarily harming Germany.
So, Roman, I would like to bring you back in. Gerhard Schröder was very consistent, shall we say, in his stance. Let's just live with the fact that Russia is our close neighbour. Let's just forge ties wherever we can. No, we don't like this war. That is also something that belongs in this big picture. This is not a war that he would have suggested, is something that Gerhard Schröder has said, but he's never outright called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. So what has been the perspective from the Ukrainian side when you look at Putin's proposal?
Well, speaking about Gerhard Schröder, we should also remember that after the full-scale invasion in 2022, there was a lot of criticism here in Germany. And I don't remember exactly if it was before or after that there were attempts to exclude him from his own Social Democratic Party. Those attempts failed. But he's still very, very controversial inside his party. Having said that, we should also remember that his idea from that interview that we've just heard, 2017, remember? So it was after Crimea, but before the full-scale invasion. Those ideas were not just Schröder's ideas. It was, I would say it was a consensus in a Social Democratic Party, which was a part of the coalition all that time. And also in the whole government of Angela Merkel. For years, it has been the idea, yes, Russia is a problematic partner, but we still are partners. We are building that Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which Merkel started, which she took over from Schröder. He is the father of that pipeline, pumping gas from Russia to Germany through the Baltic Sea. It was built during Merkel time, and the second one after Crimea was also built and started. Merkel just did the same thing that Schröder did. Let us not forget that. And of course, there is an interesting point to Schröder as a kind of mediator between Russia and Ukraine, because he had this role. He had this role in March 2022, just a few weeks after the full-scale invasion. He traveled to Moscow. In March 2022, he talked to Vladimir Putin. Then he traveled to Istanbul, to Turkey, where he spoke with the Ukrainian delegation. So he tried to mediate. He said in interviews, Ukrainian side asked him to do it. We had no confirmation of that from Kyiv, from the Ukrainian authorities, and we have no details whatsoever. but he was already in the role that Vladimir Putin is trying to give him again. But the resistance in Germany and in Ukraine as well is too big for that. Everybody understands who Gerhard Schröder is, that he's not neutral. He's Vladimir Putin's buddy. They are very, very close friends and have been for decades. That's why I think there is a second turn of that discussion, ideas that maybe Schröder could do this in a team with Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who is now German federal president, used to be foreign minister in Angela Merkel's government. And this is something that maybe Putin had in mind. I'll just set this stone rolling, and then we'll see what happens.
And that is a very, very important aspect. Is this about Gerhard Schröder and the realistic prospect of him becoming the mediator, or is this about what this proposal does to Europe and to Germany, Judy?
It's very difficult to say, but what Putin, I think, wants, and what Schröder can identify with, is a kind of return to the status quo ante. And as Rowan was saying, there's been decades of this sort of motto, trade through cooperation, change will come through cooperation. Well, certainly part of the German establishment, a large part of the German establishment, whether it was the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats, actually believed in that. And they pushed for this because of history, because of the complications of the German-Russian relationship. But actually, there has been huge disappointment now over the last couple of years that this kind of special Ostpolitik, for want of a better term, this Eastern policy towards Russia, it didn't deliver. The change didn't come. If anything, the change has been very, very negative from all sorts of aspects. And so there is this disappointment among some wings of the Social Democrats who pushed for this Ostpolitik under the former chancellors Willy Brandt. Merkel continued it as well. Various chancellors continued it. But the break came on the big invasion of 2022 when Olaf Scholz, the then Social Democratic chancellor, actually shifted the mindset of dealing with Russia. This was fundamental. I think this relationship is actually broken. And if Putin thinks he can rescue it by naming Schröder as mediator, I think the time has gone. The relationship between Moscow and Berlin is so complicated and changed now.
Okay, I would like to now take this to sort of a different level and explore the reasons, the potential reasons why Vladimir Putin sees himself in a position to make this proposal. There are different theories, and I would just like to hear both your opinions. One is, of course, that it does cause division within Europe. It keeps us busy. We're discussing. We've got the politically far left people in Germany saying, hey, look, this is yet another sign that Russia does want to negotiate and you just haven't picked up Russia's offers, right? So politicians are having to explain over and over again that no, there have been no credible signs coming from the Kremlin that Putin is willing to negotiate. That is one theory, Judy.
That is one theory. But until now, even before 2022, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea, Putin didn't want anything to do with the Europeans. And yes, during the Minsk negotiations after the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Merkel was at the seat there, but the EU itself wasn't at the seat in Minsk. The French were there, but it didn't really lead anywhere. And now what you see is the realization in Moscow, perhaps, that the American mediating terms is going nowhere. And Europe did try to be involved in the talks, or at least be informed about them from the Washington side, but they were never involved whatsoever. Putin didn't want it. Yes, the Ukrainians did, but the Americans thought under Trump, well, we can work this out with Vladimir Putin. And of course, rarely was at all, actually, was President Zelenskyy of Ukraine involved in this. But what I'm getting at is that perhaps Putin sees a chance now that the American negotiations have gone nowhere. Let's see now if, since the Europeans is a bit of exhaustion steeping in, maybe we can get some decent Europeans on board to play our kind of fiddle when it comes to dealing with this war. But yes, it'll create divisions, but so far the Europeans generally are holding together on this. If they're going to hold together, they better come up with some kind of response.
Roman, did Vladimir Putin make this suggestion to get Donald Trump interested again in the peace negotiations? Because that is another theory, that Vladimir Putin feels that Donald Trump has lost interest and has sort of moved away. And Vladimir Putin really only sees himself at a negotiating table with Donald Trump. So is this proposal to bring Gerhard Schröder into the game Vladimir Putin's attempt to draw Donald Trump's attention back to Russia and Ukraine?
I think the opposite is Vladimir Putin's aim. So he knows that Donald Trump doesn't like Europe. And he thinks if I make now a gesture towards Europe, that would be very unpopular in Washington. Trump would not like it. So we have seen in the past weeks a further alienation between the United States and Germany, with Donald Trump criticizing German Chancellor Merz for not helping in his war against Iran. We've seen his plans to withdraw 5,000 American troops from Germany, which is a severe blow to Germany. And against that background, now comes the Russian proposal. Okay, let's talk. But we should remember, Vladimir Putin was not hiding that he actually hates Europe. And Russian establishment despises Europe, and I would say it's really hatred. We should always remember that. There is no change there. But I think his attempt is, as I've said at the beginning, to undermine the unity on several levels. And we didn't mention that it is also an attempt to undermine the German government, because we saw some very cautious remarks from the Social Democrats, some of them saying, oh, let's think about it. Maybe Schröder is not such a bad idea. And the German government is now going through some turbulent times because of the domestic agenda, because of the reforms that Friedrich Merz is trying to push. And the Social Democrats, at least he sees them, are not ready to go as fast as he would like to. So on the other hand, I think it's important to understand that what Russia is trying to achieve by, let's say, talking about. We don't know what will come out of it. It's just talking. But Russia could be trying to stop Europe from imposing further sanctions. This is what happened with the United States. If you talk to Donald Trump, that's what Vladimir Putin is thinking. He maybe will not be helping Ukraine like the US government used to do under Joe Biden. That was one of his ideas, and it's working. The United States is no longer a Ukrainian partner. So maybe Putin is thinking, as long as we talk with Europeans, no matter what about, they will not impose tougher sanctions on Russia. Maybe they will not send more weapons to Ukraine because we are talking. So they would be afraid to endanger the diplomatic process.
Roman, I would like to hear your thoughts on two more things that Vladimir Putin said in the speech last weekend. One was that he was making comments about potentially the war potentially coming to an end in Ukraine. And the other thing was that some observers said that for the very first time they heard the Russian leader say Господин Zelenskyy, so Mr. Zelenskyy, speaking respectfully. This is how some people interpreted it. What's your view?
Well, I don't see any changes in Vladimir Putin's position towards President Zelenskyy of Ukraine. He hates him. This will not change. But I think he has to play this game with the Europeans. This is his intention. I think that in general, the war is coming to an end. I think Russia has resources maybe for 2 years, not more, maybe less. Some experts I've been talking to in Kyiv just a few weeks ago said that if Ukraine continues that wave of attacks on Russian refineries with long-range drones and missiles, this is something completely new. And we are now seeing also the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, who traveled to Kyiv just a few days ago, saying basically the same. maybe this is a dramatic change in this war. It's too early to call, but the signs are there, and also inside the Russian economy. But my assumption would be that Vladimir Putin would still try to continue, and Russia has the resources, I think, for maybe 1 or 2 years. This is my assumption. So the war will not end this year. I don't believe this, but maybe next year, because of the pressure Vladimir Putin is feeling inside Russia, where the budget deficit this year is already bigger than it was 2025. And the situation is not getting better because Russia has some additional oil revenues because of Donald Trump's war against Iran.
And people deeply dissatisfied also with the deep strikes that are hitting Russian hinterland. The war is literally arriving in Russia. So, Judy, you've already said the Europeans cannot just say, OK, Gerhard Schröder is a nonsense proposal. They need to come up with their own idea, right? What could that be?
Well, they floated the idea of maybe having a dialogue with Putin. This was about 10 days ago. And I read as much as I could from the EU statements. But there was very little substance, very little content. And I think the point is that if you're going to say this publicly, you have to back it up with some negotiating material. And it's not there. And in fact, it sent some tremors across some of the capitals, especially the Baltic states and Poland, because they say, how do we negotiate at the moment? This is the first thing. Secondly, I wonder, did Putin raise this idea of having Gerhard Schröder as a mediator because he actually feels under pressure? And his words were carefully chosen. They weren't aggressive. They were sort of reaching out in some way. And I was wondering, is this against the background of fatigue at home and the fact that Russia isn't actually making any kind of inroads into the Donbass even properly to gain more territory? So they are certainly under pressure. So all these things are coming to play. As for the sanctions, well, the latest batch of sanctions were immediately agreed. We have, of course, a new leadership in Hungary. So this is the
country that used to always oppose.
That's right. Under the former Prime Minister Viktor Orban, they always try to block the sanctions or get concessions. And now under the new Prime Minister, Peter Magyar, without a blink, the sanctions were rolled over. We'll see, what Robert Fico, the Slovak leader, will do. I think he was in Moscow for the parade, actually. But, this kind of, these far right-wing leaders, pro-Russian, there's very few of them now in Eastern Europe. But don't forget what's happening in Eastern Germany with the big elections coming up in Saxony-Anhalt, where the far right-wing Alternative for Germany is doing very, very well. And in fact, they are now considered the biggest party in the opinion polls. So this is another headache.
They're not just far right, they're very pro-Russian.
They're very pro-Russian. Now they're, of course, very anti the American-Israeli war in Iran. This wins enormous number of supporters among the East Germans, and indeed probably among Germans as well. But all these are up, that are issues that Chancellor Merz has to deal with. And Vladimir Putin surely must be aware of all of this.
Yeah, and we'll take this opportunity to remind our viewers and listeners, of course, that we'll be watching all of that very, very carefully. And who would have thought that, regional elections in Germany with some 2 million, 3 million voters could play such a significant role potentially for the future of the European continent. So Roman Goncharenko over in Bonn at the moment from our Ukrainian service, thank you very much for joining us. And Judy Dempsey, it's been a great pleasure. And this is very much the space to watch for news from Russia and Ukraine, peace negotiations, Germany's role. And thank you very much for listening and watching today. Make sure that you subscribe to our newsletter as well. That comes out once a week.